I've put here English schools' response to COVID-19, but really a proviso to say about that is, which I think is true of all the systems we've been talking about, that much is centralised, and it's been a massive discussion point in England how much of the response has been centralised, and it arguably needs to be, but what that has left schools being able to do and unable to do to respond in their individual context. So a proviso that it really is I'm trying to talk more generally about the system rather than individual schools. But just to kind of give you an overline of the events as they happen in England, like I think other presenters have said, it was really March 2020 when everything kicked in with the first lockdown, the kind of real crisis that none of us had ever seen before. And at that point, automatically overnight, all schools and nurseries were closed, and exams were cancelled, I think, a day or two later, which has been a really big point all the way up to university level now. And certainly working in a university, we've got bulges of students because it suddenly meant that teacher assessment grades were not accepted at first. They were downgraded for very many vulnerable children as well in disadvantaged areas. And then they removed that blanket, which meant suddenly there were a load of students able to attend university, but then many deferred, and that's had knock-on effects for students this year getting in. But that's a little sideline, but it does come through as a thread that this lack of kind of exams is going to have an impact on those cohorts of students in particular for already questioning the validity of their grades and their achievements. And at that point in the first lockdown, most schools and nurseries did allow key workers and vulnerable students assessed by eligibility for free school meals and deprivation in, but that was very little uptake because most schools interpreted that as being you need to have both parents who are eligible and will not be at home. And I know a lot of nurseries, even though they had some key worker children, shut at that point because they just didn't have enough demand. But June 2020, the schools were allowed to reopen, but because it was so near the end of the school year, that's typically the third week in July, many of them, it was a half-hearted thing, a very gentle thing focused on well-being. And I looked at the notes from your last education forum, and you talked about the need for schools to consider the academic, but also the well-being and the health measures. And I really think at that point, the return to school was about prioritising children's mental health and well-being through this trauma and allowing them to readjust to being in school. And certainly at primary, but also some cases secondary, that was very limited. And we had some contestation by some schools in areas where rates were relatively high still, or just a lot of fear from the parents. So only partially schools went back. Some only went back 2 days a week. They had half the year group and the other half. And it started a few weeks earlier with the very youngest before opening up to the oldest as well. It meant, though, that the assumption was in September, everybody would be back to normal. And that is kind of how it worked out in September for the new school year. However, by that point, rates were starting to rise, first of all, in pockets of the north of England. And we did have local lockdowns which tested the system. And by that point, my research was looking at secondary schools. And certainly there, what we found is that quite a percentage of our teachers and students had experienced their bubbles bursting. So often they'd be kept in bubbles of 30 to 100 and something students to limit the spread of COVID. And once there was a case, then all of them had to stay at home for 10 days. And so schools were actually going into the September time, preparing curricula to go online, and had a chance over the summer to do so. And government funding at some point then was released to allow secondary schools to provide laptops for all, but actually not primaries. So that will come up again as something that helps schools to prepare for then what happened with a national lockdown. There was a second lockdown, but schools were named as a priority to remain open. And in fact, there was a little bit of which I think one of the other speakers referred to, a little bit of a question mark about whether schools were the cause of this rise again of a second wave at that point. So it really was only lockdown 3 in January, and Boris Johnson and the other leaders were insistent schools would remain open, to the point that parents put their children to bed saying, okay, school tomorrow, and then had to wake them up the next morning and say, nope, you're back at home for now. And the first day back at school in January, of some students who really hadn't been much at all, like 4 and 5-year-old children. It was awful. But at that point, nurseries were allowed to stay open. Exams then pretty quickly were cancelled then once it was clear that it was going to be 6 weeks or more that schools would be shut. It wouldn't be fair on those students again. And this time though, especially because the government had been insisting schools wouldn't close, many more key workers, people were scrambling for key worker places. They'd seen how parents, like I think Professor Aplaka had said, they're not prepared to be homeschoolers, and some of them had faced disastrous situations. So, you know, they were desperate to get one or all of their children back into school. And then some schools were reporting up to 50%, 60% of their students were asking to come in. And they were eligible according to the much broader guidelines, and schools were panicking. But so that was also a management issue, but also a reality that you know, 25% roughly of students were actually in school during that second lockdown, and they had a very different experience, which I'll come back to. Then around February, so, a very eminent educator, Kevin Collins, was appointed to head the Recovery Commission. That made the government look like they were taking things really seriously, and he was talking about a 15 billion recovery programme. Basically, a few days ago, he resigned when the government said it would be 1.4 billion pounds instead. It basically works out as £22, which is, I think, about $40 or less per pupil, when apparently the US is over 1,000. And so he's resigned in disgust and said, no, that is not a kind of budget that is going to make any difference. And none of the plans that he was prioritizing, you know, 3 prongs, 3 T's: teaching, you know, investing in helping teachers, but tutoring for catch up, but also just time in subjects that have been missed during the pandemic. And then basically shortly after mid-March onwards, schools pretty quickly reopened with a slightly different focus this time, actually, although there was some element of the need to process trauma. That was far less because, you know, we've had vaccinations rise, so cases have definitely fallen. And I think this was about, right, let's get back to learning business a bit more this time. So I'm going to be talking about comparing lockdown learning at home and at school, and some of the things that came up during those. In lockdown 1, the real issue, and I think this is probably for every system in this, was about moving online. And although a few children, certainly from my interviews with children, definitely thrived from being more independent, they could pursue their own learning, particularly at primary level. 11-year-olds, you know, they actually love not having that structure. Actually, there was a whole fragmentation of learning, and so cohorts of children, you know, some learned well online or were given resources, and in other schools they weren't really given very much, and it was a bit of a disaster. So kind of there was a focus on well-being from schools who were left in this panicky situation, particularly primary schools in more vulnerable areas, disadvantaged areas. The focus was really like, how are our kids going to, you know, manage lockdown in homes where things are a little bit chaotic? So it was literally teachers providing lunches by walking to all the different homes of children in the area sometimes. And there were a lot of more welfare referrals as well. But comparing that situation and then with lockdown 2 in November, schools were way more prepared. So there were still some digital issues, particularly around this laptop scheme, and primaries, again, not being able to access that. But schools had been able to plan, and through these little local lockdowns or burst bubbles, it prepared them for that second lockdown. And actually, from talking to students and teachers in our recent research, their experience of that is far smoother. You know, no, I mean, they didn't always like it, you know, and there were issues that other people have talked about with the quality of Zoom learning, but they knew what they were doing. They felt that they were part of a school community, and they knew what was happening and a lot of the students talked about making progress in that time. Obviously, there's an equity concern about this lockdown learning at home, which I think is probably true everywhere. I've talked about the laptop scheme, but during the second lockdown as well, the mobile phone companies started to talk about using, because some schools and children would be dependent on using phones and uploading pictures of work on their phones, talking about free phone broadband for vulnerable children. I'm not sure how successful that was, but it's certainly one of our things that we're trying to push for, that should maybe be a broadband kind of scholar scheme that would provide all families with some kind of token or incentive to be able to get free broadband ongoing to support home learning. And obviously then when we talk about lockdown learning at home, we're talking in the most recent lockdown, in some cases 25% of students still being in school, and some of those students, particularly the most vulnerable, thrived because they had far more small group attention during that time. However, teachers were massively overloaded, particularly in the second lockdown, because it was almost double work. Sometimes they were having to teach in class but have, you know, the video on and parents and students watching at home. And I had that at university as well, and it's very stressful. And then having to mark and set things online. And it also meant that actually the quality for some children who were in school wasn't as good, because they were basically sat, their teacher was at home maybe, and they were sat in school on a laptop. So it was very different again. Learning once back at school, the question was about this in the first lockdown, a more well-being focus, in the second lockdown maybe a more learning focus on return to school. But obviously once children did return to school, well, what did that look like? And certainly for the students I was looking at, it was, you know, massive restrictions on them, and the impact on schools and particularly children of masks, needing to wear them, not particularly getting on with those, but also feeling in new schools for transitioning pupils that it created a barrier in terms of relationships. But bubbles as well, you know, the restricted numbers, which in primary school maybe students are very used to being in smaller groups, but in secondary school, you know, they're used to more freedom. Play equipment and space, a lot of the students we've spoken to talked of just being 100 students in a football pitch. You know, that was where they're allowed to go at lunchtime, and they're not allowed to interact with others. And then a particularly restricted curriculum, and I'd be interested to hear how much that is the case in other countries and other contexts. But you know, certainly at primary, a focus on English and maths, and in the first lockdown, and you know, more kind of open-ended project. Okay, well, let's do this. My interest in languages, a lot of languages learning, primary and secondary, was just axed. I believe in the second lockdown that wasn't quite the same, but certainly a lot of practical activities back at school haven't been taking place for all of year 7. So they haven't been able to go in many cases to science blocks or art studios, so they haven't been doing science experiments, a lot of the children are telling me. But in the last few weeks, that's starting to change now that our rates have come down, although they might be rising up again here. And yeah, I've talked about local outbreaks, and you know, possibly there'll be more of those. Lateral flow testing at secondary, so to allow secondaries to open, the government, you know, introduced routine testing to allow students to come back to school, and then ongoing. And actually schools have worked really hard. They've actually taken over the government's job in a lot of these cases in organising this. There hasn't been the provision. You know, when there's been an outbreak, it's the head teacher during their school holidays spending 6 hours on the phone ringing every parent to tell them, you know. But the lateral flow testing has been useful in kind of tracking things, and there have been false positives, but it is kind of well managed now at this point. And catch-up tutoring has been a big thing of part of this recovery commission. It's all been talked about, and you know, these huge budgets that have just now shrunk, and it still hasn't been distributed. And there's been some question about, you know, well, where are these tutors going to come from, and how is that going to be managed? And it looks now, with that Kevin Collins resigning, we're back a bit to square one on everything. And I've talked about the uncertainty for exam year groups and the knock-on problems for admissions and transitions in general. Specific issues for the students that I've been talking to, year 6 to 7 transition, that they've obviously lost out on a lot of their leaving of primary school. Some of them didn't even go back to primary school after lockdown lifted, and they had no opportunities to visit their secondary school, but they have adapted so well. And secondary schools tried and moved a lot of the stuff online, but that created equity issues for those who didn't have that digital access, which primary schools then tried to provide in that little window before starting. But some children were missed, and particularly in the research that we did, the children we're concerned about is those who get normally extra support, like those with special needs or from vulnerable backgrounds, would normally get extra days at their secondary school, and they just didn't get anything extra. However, you know, secondary schools, once children started, often gave one extra day or a few days where it's just year 7. And one of the things that we've seen is this idea that bubbles have actually acted in a way as an extended transition. And when you look at the transition specific literature, that is something to be welcomed, that transition isn't seen as just one event, but an ongoing thing. And I'm just trying to think, I'm aware of time. Yeah, I think I've talked about the restricted curriculum and other things that are on there. Yeah, and no and little extracurricular trips or clubs. That has made a kind of difference to students, but they understand why. But in a way, their friendships have been a little limited. But year 7 is kind of seen, perhaps wrongly, as a bit of a remedial year. Secondary schools assume that students aren't really at the levels that their primary schools say they're at, and they kind of take a backward step anyway. So for a lot of the students, they feel that actually year 7 has been quite gentle, and they feel that it's maybe because teachers have been a bit gentle on them coming back. But so maybe the specific issues for transitioning pupils haven't been as bad as we wanted. And this is kind of talking about the COVID dividend that I think the previous speaker talked about. What is that in terms of the, I can only really talk necessarily about the research that I'm doing, but certainly this online learning leap, you know, this our survey data shows that teachers' confidence when they rated themselves on online learning before the pandemic and after the first lockdown, after the second lockdown, you know, it's just leap. Schools and students are also saying that now more routinely homework is provided online, that it's much smoother to manage, also schools are ready now for other emergencies. We don't have monsoons, we don't have earthquakes in England, but my local school was burnt down in October. So the kids had been back 6 weeks and it was burnt down, and it took them 6 months to get back, you know, to schools. But schools were ready now to do that. To provide other types of learning, but the digital divide is still massively there, and I think we've all spoken about that. Bubbles, we've talked about, I mentioned that kind of, have they been actually protecting transitioning students? So those students going in have been kept with their class or maybe their year group, often in one building. It means they've had less interaction with older pupils. They haven't got lost in these big campuses. And many of them have talked about those kind of close relationships with their class, because they would usually have different teachers and be going to different rooms, but they've become much closer. But they also have mixed views, and they do want to meet other students. And then finally, is this an opportunity, certainly in England, for an exam system overhaul? So going back to trusting teachers, you know, there was this revolt when teacher grades were taken in, teacher assessments, and then graded by a central government algorithm, like, oh, well, you said this in this area of London, but typically your students in this area of London don't achieve as well as that. So we're going to downgrade all your students' grades by a mark. So there were students, some schools where no students were coming out with A's, but they did, you know, usually have some, and they were losing their university. And then there was just such a public revolt, as Professor Ablaka talked about, you know, no, actually we need to trust the teachers, and actually maybe more rigor can be put around in this year. That teacher assessment system, it's creating a massive workload for teachers, but actually if that exam system can be overhauled to look much more rigorously at teacher assessment, again, that might provide an opportunity to move away from this assumption that the written exam is everything. It isn't in the English context, but it's still a huge thing. So that's just some of my thoughts there, and some of my experiences. And I look forward to the panel discussion in a little bit, where maybe we can talk about some of the issues that come across all of us. So thank you.